Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 214, April 14th to April 19th, 1865. Last week, we came to the conclusion of the war in the East, or the main theater. While Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia is heading home, the war, importantly, is not over yet. Johnson is still in North Carolina, and there are still pockets of resistance elsewhere. As such, there would be a dramatic and desperate attempt to turn the table at the buzzer, and it would come at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Before we get to those events, though, we do need to talk about our Patreon content, and of course, we do have some episodes that have been posted. Most recently, we had a picture slideshow that was posted that shows some of the events that we talked about last week, those locations. That's Sailor's Creek, before that Fort Stedman, and then also Five Forks. So we have a couple of different locations, what they look like today, and of course, very relevant to our story here as we wrap up things in the main theater of the war here in 1865. We've done other picture slideshows before, other modern-day battlefields, memoir reviews, movie reviews as well. And if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. And those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So if you have been paying attention to the narrative, you might be asking why an assassination of Abraham Lincoln is necessary. The war is essentially over. Lee had surrendered his army, and Johnson is soon to follow, an event that we're actually going to get into next week. But the fact is that already there had been attempts on Abraham Lincoln. Remember that there had been a plot to off him on the way to his inauguration. And we talked about that. Speaking of our movie reviews, we talked about that in The Tall Target, how very accurate some of those events were that were depicted in that movie. And it's kind of like our unsung hero of our movies that we've reviewed and watched for the Patreon. Well, Lincoln was known to spend time at his summer home, the named Soldiers' Home, and that was in the capital, which had been land purchased by Winfield Scott for retired soldiers. He would often travel there alone, a fact that was not unknown by the Confederates. Bradley Johnson, who we talked about in connection with Early's campaign on Washington, had actually hatched a raid that would capture the president and return him to Virginia. Remember, Bradley is also part of the plot to free some Confederate prisoners. So he kind of raids into Maryland for a time, and they were going to try to go to Point Lookout and free some Confederate prisoners, kind of work in concert with the Confederate Navy. It was probably just as harebrained schemed as the Dahlgren raid, which we're about to talk about here, but that's also something that was on the table for Bradley Johnson. Using Lincoln as a bargaining chip would be an interesting concept, but Davis and the Confederates would feel that the president being killed in the process, or otherwise his family harmed, would be outside the realm of what they wanted to accomplish. An interesting fallout of the Dahlgren raid, though, would be that the South was going to be more receptive, especially as the war was going downhill for them, to commit acts that were going to be considered poor form earlier in the war. You recall this raid that had been launched by Kilpatrick, an ambitious effort that really had no hope for success, to not only free all the prisoners on Belle Isle, but also to eliminate the Confederate government. Ulrich Dahlgren had been found in possession of a document to support this, and thus there was an outcry from the Southern people. It was seen as fair game then to return the favor, and plans would begin to be made. Amazingly, there was a plan by the Confederate Torpedo Bureau to blow up the White House. Remember that we had Gabriel Rains and his department recently having detonated a device at City Point near Grant's headquarters. While the use of landmines was considered to be barbaric, there would be a plan to lure the president and then destroy the White House. Amazingly, this might have been an easier task than you might think. Lincoln had limited guards, a sharp contrast to our current presidents. Forebodingly, he would state that if someone was really determined to kill him, then there was really nothing that he could do to stop it. This connects with Lincoln's belief in predestination. While he was not religious in the contemporary sense, he did have a monotheistic view that included several Protestant tenets. The bomb experts would be attached to Mosby's famous command, but they would be scattered due to a cavalry patrol. Because of this involvement, Mosby is constantly considered to be part of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He's kind of one of the suspects that are on the table. He's obviously been terrorizing the Northern Virginia and Washington region for some time. So because he's kind of involved with helping to get these guys closer to their goal to blow up the White House, he's kind of on that short list. And that's one of the things that we talked about in his memoir review, where he's like, I don't really want to surrender because they're going to think that I'm going to be part of this plot to kill the president. Confederate agents would also have a grand plan to infect the North using biological efforts. This would be foiled as the object was to gather clothing from the victims of yellow fever and distribute them at various targets, including trying to deliver some to the president himself. While this plot did not succeed, it was a good example of the South having to resort to desperate acts, and also that nothing was going to be off the table. Part of the reason that it doesn't succeed is that yellow fever is not spread in the way that they think it did back then, right? Or we've talked about before about how there's kind of a very limited study of thought on germ theory and whatnot, so it wasn't going to work the way they thought it would anyway. While a raid on Washington was off the table in 1862, by 1865, things were very different. Several conspirators would thus attempt to pull off the boldest plan yet. But who exactly were these conspirators? If you have taken a grade school history class, you might be under the impression that John Wilkes Booth was just a lone wolf, so to speak, a crazy person who took matters into his own hands. But there is a wider group of individuals, not to mention sanctioned action by the Confederate government. Already we have talked about the Knights of the Golden Circle, and already we have gone over Southern covert operations throughout the war. Often involved in these desperate efforts, they would be in the thick of the plot, and not only try to take out Lincoln, but Seward and Johnson as well. Booth is obviously the star of the show, in more ways than one. His father was Junius Brutus Booth, a famed actor. Two of his older brothers were also actors. The entire family sounds like they were full of dramatics, so very artsy folk. But Johnny was not only artsy growing up in Bel Air, Maryland, but he also became a white supremacist. Remember we talked about John attending the execution of John Brown back before the war began. He would become involved in various plots to kidnap the president, but as Lee surrenders, it would change from kidnapping to more drastic measures. Booth would travel to Canada and start to liaison with Confederate agents. Montreal at the time was going to be a hub for rebels. They would be able to connect him with an extensive network that would be operating in southern Maryland. Remember that state was divided between the more mountainous western portion, which was not so pro-Confederate, and the Chesapeake region that was indeed more pro-slavery because there were more plantation-style homes there. This would include Dr. Mudd, whose involvement in the plots has come into question. If you are familiar with the expression clear as mud, well, there you go, this is where it comes from. Recent evaluations have thrown out the notion that he was just an innocent caught up in the desperate acts of others. Mudd was actually an integral part for introductions for Booth to various other individuals who would guide him through the roads of Maryland and ferry him across to Virginia. Besides this assistance from an already established Confederate network, he would also have a friend in Samuel Arnold join his group, Arnold being a native of Maryland and a Confederate Army veteran. It should be noted that Booth was actually very charming and persuasive in his manner. So too would childhood friend Michael O'Laughlin join him in his early plots. George Atzerodt was an immigrant and ferryman, a boatmaker before his involvement in the scheme, and he would be also an integral part of getting him to safety. This would be part of his introductions through this network for Confederate mail, right? There's a kind of a network there where you can have a letter that can be sent into Virginia, and Dr. Mudd is certainly part of that. John Harrison Surratt was a Confederate agent that would also be introduced to Booth. He would be involved in the early schemes to simply kidnap the president as opposed to murdering him. He was a seasoned spy and not present during the assassination, being seen in Elmira, New York. Now, there's also kind of a question as to whether he knew about the murder plot or not. He's going to be put on trial as such after the event. He's actually going to be kind of hunt down, and there's a manhunt for him actually as well. But he's going to be put on trial, and he is going to actually be acquitted because there were enough witnesses that saw him in both places, so there really couldn't come to a guilty verdict. His mother, Mary Surratt, owned a boarding house in D.C. and a tavern in Maryland, which would be important meeting places. Another Confederate veteran and a member of Mosby's command at one point, Lewis Thornton Powell, would be important to the eventual plot as well. He would be tasked with taking out William Seward. While many consider Booth crazy and eccentric, there was at least some chance of the plots coming to fruition. The former actor would find out that the president was attending a performance at a hospital, which might have been the best opportunity for his capture, not assassination. At the last moment, the president called it off. This is where the plans would start to shift from taking the president to killing him. Especially with talks of citizenship for the enslaved and Lee's surrender, this would expedite Booth's plan. He would use his connections to the theaters in Washington to try to figure out where the president was going to attend a play. Interestingly enough, this was not going to be seen as unusual because a lot of the mail that he received was actually going to the various theaters. He didn't really have a home address, so nobody really knew how to get a hold of him. So he could go to the different theaters and check to see whether he had any mail, because fan mail or whatnot, whatever. And obviously, it wouldn't be seen as out of the norm. Eventually, it was announced that Lincoln would be attending a production at Ford's Theater, a location that Booth knew well, having performed there 13 times. There would be a presidential box draped with American flags, which would contain a makeshift divider and a kind of vestibule area. This was going to be the perfect setup for Booth. To truly unhinge the government, plans were made for Powell, alias Payne, to take out Seward at his home, and then Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was staying at the Kirkwood Hotel, at Surratt tasked with this target. The night of the 14th, the conspirators would meet for one last time and finally unleash the plot. Meanwhile, Lincoln would have a very pleasant day on April 14th. His son had been attached to General Grant's staff and was home, and the war seemed like it was truly coming to a close. While men like Stanton wished to pursue the Confederate leaders and try them for treason, Lincoln was content to let them go. Washington was full of individuals who were still celebrating, so it was hard probably to want to continue a hard war. Johnson was sure to surrender, and Kirby Smith was isolated. Lincoln's wife was set to attend Ford's Theater, and originally had extended an invitation to the Grants. The Grants, though, would wish to head to New Jersey to see their children, which might have been an excuse to avoid Mary Todd on the part of Julia. Reportedly, there had been an embarrassing situation in Virginia when the armies were being reviewed by the president, and Mary Todd had to be talked off a ledge because there were women riding with the party of the president. There is a common myth that if the Grants had been present, then the plot would not have been able to be carried out. However, Grant had previously attended the theater with the president and had not had any kind of extra security. Lincoln was famously against the escorts at church and at the theater, thinking that the public needed to see him without any guards. Now, that's actually kind of a wild concept, right? It's something that, and I know I constantly make these comparisons to the modern day versus back then. It's kind of hard to fathom that the president of the United States and the commander of all the United States armies would not have any extra security at a theater event or going to church or whatnot, right? I feel like that's something that's obviously quite foreign to us. Now, There might have been additional individuals there who might have been, attending perhaps on Grant, but it would not have been like an armed guard at the box, for instance. Lincoln had been content to maybe stay in for the evening, but it was an important day. Robert Anderson would raise the colors over Fort Sumter once again, having lost that fortification back in 1861. Grant, though, would be on a train to New Jersey, leaving the Lincolns to go to Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris for an invitation. Late to the theater, the Lincolns would arrive and be placed in their box. Reportedly, Mary Todd Lincoln would hold her husband's arm and say, "What would Miss Harris think of me holding on to you?" Abraham would reply, "She won't think anything about it," which are reportedly the last words of the president. They would have one bodyguard placed in the theater, but the performance that evening of the comedy Our American Cousin was going to be packed, given that the president's attendance had been advertised. Probably as many as 1,700 would be there to see the performance. Booth would use his status as an actor to gain entrance into the theater without incident. He'd ask for his horse to be watched in the back alley behind the stage. Moving through the crowded theater, he would make his way to the president's box. Amazingly, the security for the president was not outside the box or in the vestibule area. They had actually gone to have a better position for which they could watch the play. The actor would have a small derringer for the president, and should Grant have been president, a knife for him. Besides knowing the makeup of the theater, Booth was also familiar with the play itself. So while he hid in the vestibule area, he would wait for a particularly comedic line, one that usually provided a lot of laughter from the audience. I've seen it actually thrown out there, too, that this is the kind of play that Lincoln liked to go see, and it's kind of sort of fitting that this is what he went to see, because the plot of Our American Cousin is that there's these English folks, and they have this cousin from America who they think is kind of like this rich guy, but it turns out to just sort of be a yokel, and obviously hilarity will ensue from there. But you have Lincoln as being kind of this backwoodsy type guy, likes to tell stories and whatnot, so he probably would have maybe connected with the play a little bit to a degree. He's kind of a fish out of water scenario, fish out of water as the president, just as this individual is going back to this high society in England. Once the line was delivered, though, Booth would place the derringer behind the president's ear and pull the trigger. The bullet would pass through his brain and lodge into his eye socket, his body immediately slumping over. Major Rathbone would struggle with Booth, who would produce the knife and stab him in the arm, jumping off the balcony onto the stage, his foot being caught in the flag, crucially making it so that he would land awkwardly and break his leg. In front of the stunned crowd, he would famously exclaim, "Sic semper tyrannis," before pushing through the back door, knocking the horse holder to the ground, and thundering off into the night. Lincoln would immediately be attended by surgeons who were in attendance. All the blood in the box was actually from Major Rathbone, the wound not being clear upon initial examination, as the hole was small and had clotted. Enlisting the help of several soldiers, the surgeons would remove the president and be guided to the nearest open house diagonally, the house of Taylor William Peterson on 10th Street. He was placed diagonally on a bed, as he was too tall, the surgeons having to remove the hysterical Mary Todd. Gideon Wells and Edward Stanton would arrive, guards keeping the crowd away. Surgeons would realize there was really nothing they could do other than make the president comfortable. Abraham Lincoln would pass at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. The gravity would not be lost on Gideon Wells or Edwin Stanton for that matter, who had arrived, Stanton exclaiming that now he's with the ages. In the meantime, Powell would enter William Seward's home under the pretense that he was delivering medicine to the Secretary of State, and needed to show him exactly how to take it. Many were skeptical to this story, but Seward had been recovering from a carriage fall, so it was not the worst cover. Seward's son would block Powell, though, for a time, but his daughter would actually alert the would-be assassin to the location of the secretary. Upon learning the location of William Seward, Powell would attempt to use his pistol to take out his son, although it would misfire, him then resorting to use it as a club to knock down the man that was standing in the way of his target. Moving on the secretary, he would use a knife, slashing him and attempting to stab his jugular, but the brace that was used for Seward's jaw would stop the knife. Moore would be alerted to the attempt, Powell forcing his way from the house and fleeing. Atzerodt, in the meantime, would fail to move on the vice president, Johnson being fortunate and possibly implicated in the assassination as a result. As it was, Johnson would not begin preparations for the pursuit, but rather Edwin Stanton would take temporary control of the government. Some would point to this as proof of his own involvement, and certainly the South would make sure to demonize the harsh Stanton. As such, the manhunt would begin immediately. Witnesses were questioned, starting to piece the picture that it was indeed John Wilkes Booth who had assassinated the president. Booth, for his part, had been stopped on a bridge leading to Maryland, and amazingly, had not used a fake name, and also gave the actual destination of where he was going to the questioning guard. The bridges around Washington were designed to keep people out, something that the Union could thank John Singleton Mosby for, and as such, Booth would ride on to his rendezvous point. David Harold was the only one to meet Booth there, Harold having been tasked with guiding Powell to the home of Seward, but upon the commotion had fled. The two would make their way to the Surratt Tavern, grabbing stashed weapons there. Mary Surratt, whose involvement has been questioned, had made sure that the weapons and a box for Booth containing his field glasses were ready, bringing some light that she was in fact aware of the plot to kill the president. There's a lot of kind of back and forth of whether Mary Surratt was like in the boarding house in D.C. and then she kind of goes back to the tavern, right? And there's a lot that's made of how much she actually knew about the plot itself. Now, obviously, I think we can't completely paint either her or Samuel Mudd, for that matter, as complete innocents. They knew something was up, right? They knew that there was some kind of covert activity, probably launched with maybe not the sanction of the Confederate government, but at least with the assistance of the Confederate government that was happening. So probably not necessarily completely innocent in that regard. So I think that notion we can kind of throw out the window, but exactly how much they knew that this was actually a plot to kill the president is brought into question. Now, there is a couple key pieces of evidence that you can kind of throw out there that Booth kind of lets them know, something's going to happen beforehand. So there's a little bit of that goes back and forth, and there's, I think, really still debated a little bit to this day. Booth was going to make his way to the house of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd was, in fact, a medical doctor, and he would be able to make a splint for the broken leg of the assassin. By this time, police and federal cavalry were starting to search for Booth. Mudd was questioned about the two strangers reportedly that had been at his house. His wife had stated that one, that being Booth, had used fake whiskers. Mudd would deny he knew either, but upon a second questioning would produce a boot that had belonged to the wounded assassin, one that in fact had his name on the inside. Mudd would also be implicated by others, including Arnold and Atzerodt, who were both apprehended. Arnold not being in the area, but working as a clerk at Fort Monroe. Atzerodt would be picked up by federal cavalry, a testament to the intelligence network that had been created in Maryland, mostly out of necessity with all the pro-Southern individuals there living. An intelligence gatherer had reported that there was a suspicious character in the vicinity of Germantown, Maryland. The conspirator had made his way to his cousin's house, where he stayed for 3 days. Interestingly, his brother had also alerted authorities that this might be where he was hiding out. Mary Surratt would also be taken into custody, her boarding house cited as a potential spot for individuals who might have assassinated the president. Ironically, as authorities were there to take Mary in, so too would they take Powell, who would show up at exactly the wrong time, professing to be a ditch digger. He would be identified by a servant of the Sewards as the attacker. But despite the quick apprehensions, or relatively quick apprehensions, of these conspirators, there was still an absence of the apprehension of Harold and Booth. A $100,000 reward would thus be placed on their heads. Harold and Booth would in the meantime make their way to the home of Samuel Cox, who was a militia captain in the area. He would refer them to a fellow member of the Confederate mail network who would ferry the individuals across the Potomac. With the fugitives hiding out in a swamp, they would be given a boat to make their way to Virginia. Dodging a U.S. naval vessel, eventually they would make their way to the Virginia side. Moving further into the state, they would arrive at the Rappahannock River. Once ferried across, they would recruit the help of returning Confederates, who had belonged to Mosby's command. These rebels would put Harold and Booth at the house of a man named Garrett, some of the party continuing on in the direction of Bowling Green. A party of the 16th New York Cavalry, led by the leader of what would become known as the Secret Service, Lafayette Baker, and the former colonel of the 1st D.C. Cavalry, would be in the meantime moving to Port Royal, a small town at the river crossing. They would be there as a result of actually some false information about two strangers in the area. Moving past the Garrett farm, the sons of the owner would see it as suspicious that the two strangers hid in the woods at their approach of the troopers. But they would be on their way, eventually going to Bowling Green, where they apprehended one of Mosby's men who would help the fugitives. Very quickly, this individual would actually give up the two conspirators. It's not really his fight anymore, right? So he's going to very quickly kind of fold and lead them back to the Garrett farm where they had left Booth. And actually there is a little bit of a back and forth here because Mosby's men and actually Harold go on to a house that's kind of like halfway between Bowling Green and Port Royal. And so there's kind of like a little bit of a run around there with the pursuers and trying to actually track down where Booth is. At the Garrett farm itself as well, the suspicious activity of Booth and Harold had not been unnoticed by the host, and so they were sleeping in a tobacco barn and they had been locked in there because something was up, right? The pursuing authorities would arrive and actually question Garrett, threatening to hang him if he did not give up the assassins. His sons would come to the rescue as they had locked the two conspirators in the tobacco barn. Surrounded, the game was up. Booth would call out that they should have a fair fight, but Harold was not up for that prospect and would give himself up. The tobacco barn would be set on fire. In the commotion, a sergeant would fire on Booth, hitting him in the back of the head and neck, severing his spine. Removed from the burning barn and to the porch of the farmhouse, the paralyzed Booth would ask Baker to tell his mother that he died for his country. John Wilkes Booth had escaped for 12 days, but he would be killed on April 26th. The fact that he had been killed and not taken alive is one of the pieces of evidence to show that there was a larger conspiracy involving Stanton, but obviously this really doesn't have a whole lot of legs to stand on. Booth's body and Harold would be transported to Washington, where Stanton had all the conspirators, save for John Surratt, in custody. Immediately there would be a question of a trial. Stanton argued for a military commission, as a civil court would not do for the crimes committed, the assassination not being murder but rather because of war aims. David Hunter would preside over the case, with some familiar faces also included in the tribunal: Lew Wallace, August Couts, Albion Howe, and Robert Foster. The case was particularly unique in that shorthand transcriptions were created and then given to the defense and the prosecution after each day. The defense would actually include Thomas Ewing, if you recall, a lawyer before the war. There would be a question of the concept of conspiracy. For instance, if the original conspiracy was kidnapping and then it changed to murder, then even those who signed up for the less violent option would still be culpable for murder. In some cases, it was argued that the murder scheme was not known by the defense. Certainly this was the case for O'Laughlin and Arnold, who were not involved in the April 14th plot. Mudd would argue repeatedly that he did not know Booth and had only met him once. This would be disputed by the prosecution, and actually he would admit as much on his way to imprisonment in the Dry Tortugas. Powell was sort of screwed, but maybe not being executed was on the table for him. Atzerodt and Harold were both shown by the defense as just being the boatman and a road navigator, and nothing more than that. The trial would last 7 weeks, with 366 witness testimonies. Everyone would be found guilty. Samuel Mudd would be spared being put to death by one vote. He would join Arnold, O'Laughlin, and Edmund Spangler, who had been tasked with holding Booth's horse, in prison, all but the latter for life. Moda would actually try to escape prison when his jailers were changed to the 82nd United States Color Troops. This is actually kind of shocking because he was actually living a fairly cushy life in prison. He was a doctor after all, so he was actually employed as such while he was there. It's kind of like a Captain Blood scenario, if you've ever seen that Errol Flynn movie. Errol Flynn, before he becomes a pirate and before he's serving as a slave in the Caribbean, he's actually going to be a doctor, so they're actually going to be using his skills because there's a lack of doctors in the area, so it's very similar. But it does kind of show his motivation, and it shows why he was kind of part of this network of spies and mail carriers for the Confederacy, so it does kind of highlight exactly where his motivations were lying. Mary Surratt, Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt were all sentenced to death. It was actually the court's recommendation that executive intervention be used in the case of Mary. Unfortunately, President Johnson would miss the document that he should have signed to stay her execution. She would be hanged along with the other three on July 7th. John Surratt would be criticized for escaping, his mother being a kind of stand-in for him. He would flee to Canada and make his way to Rome, serving in the Papal Zouaves. Someone would recognize him there, though, and inform the U.S. consulate. He would be arrested and escape, trying to make his way to Egypt, but he would be apprehended. John would be put on trial in 1867, but with multiple witnesses placing him at both Elmira and in Washington, there would be no verdict. Later in life, he would give lectures on the plot to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, taking whether or not he knew about the murder scheme to his grave. And so, we must say goodbye to Abraham Lincoln. I think he's a unique president in that he is sort of the right guy for a crisis as big as the Civil War. We have a lot of similar events in history that are pretty traumatic, right? They're pretty violent clashes where we have these leaders who might have been just fine leaders in ordinary times, but given the situations that they get placed in, they're just not the right guy for the job. So Abraham Lincoln is very much the right guy, we can safely assume. He does a good job either surrounding himself with experts while also trying to learn enough to be intelligent on matters such as war. He has an interest in invention and also sets a lenient precedent for bringing the southern states back into the Union. While not without his flaws, he can really be placed as one for the ages, as Stanton exclaimed. In a future episode, I might continue to talk Abraham Lincoln, as I think it's worth a deeper dive. Let's go ahead and call it a day right there. We had the assassination of Abraham Lincoln today, and the manhunt for the conspirators responsible. John Wilkes Booth would be killed, and the others brought to justice, although it is not without its controversy. Next week, we're going to shift back to the Carolinas. We need to talk about the end of Johnson's army, which will occur at Bennett's Place. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Post it in the description, show a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.